Now, from CBS 4 News, this is Facing South Florida with Jim DeFede.
Good morning, I'm Jim DeFede, and welcome to Facing South Florida. Later in the show, we'll look at how the coronavirus in China is hurting the lobster fishermen in the Florida Keys. We'll also introduce you to a group of high school students who just came back from Tallahassee. They are trying to do something about the opioid crisis. But first, this has got to be one of the wildest weeks we've seen in Washington in a long time. Mitt Romney gave an impassioned speech about how his faith led him to break from his party and vote against Donald Trump on impeachment. Nevertheless, the president, as expected, was acquitted. We then had the State of the Union that ended with Nancy Pelosi tearing up the president's speech. The president then made an appearance at the National Prayer Breakfast that was anything but prayerful. And that was followed a few hours later by a rambling, hour-long nationally televised speech by the president from the East Room of the White House that was an equal parts campaign rally and therapy session. Here is a small taste of the week that was.
Two-thirds of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that the respondent, Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the first article of impeachment.
I want to apologize to my family for having them have to go through a phony, rotten deal by some very evil and sick people.
I don't like people who use their faith as justification for doing what they know is wrong. Nor do I like people who say, I pray for you, when they know that that's not so.
I don't know if the president understands about prayer or people who do pray. I thought what he said about Senator Romney was particularly without class.
Ooh, a lot of tension there. We are joined now by Patricia Mazzei, the Miami bureau chief for the New York Times, who was drafted into impeachment coverage in Washington. Patty, thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
I guess if you had a choice between spending time in lovely sunny Miami or Washington, well, I guess Washington was an interesting 2 weeks to be up there.
It had to be winter.
It had to be winter, of course it did. So what did it feel like covering it? I realize you don't cover Congress day to day, you're based in Miami, but you've covered politics for a long time. Did you get a sense of the moment while you were there, or were you just so caught up in the day-to-day, minute-by-minute developments that you didn't have a chance to really understand the significance of what was going on?
I think because I parachuted in, I did get a sense of the history that was happening. Even if it was a story where you knew the likely conclusion, the outcome, which was the president at all times looked like he was going to get acquitted in this trial in the Senate, the twists and turns that it took to get there were fascinating. And when you were there, especially for votes for the State of the Union, you knew that you were witnessing something important. Who knows how history will look at it, but as reporters, we're there for the first draft, right? And even being there at the vote for the witnesses, where they decided not to have witnesses in the trial. And every senator has to stand up and say yay or nay, and it's a roll call. You just sort of feel the weight of it in the room. Now,
I know you spent turns in the Senate gallery watching the proceedings, coming in and out, because you weren't allowed to use electronic devices in there. You had to rotate out with other reporters on a regular basis to sort of like do a rotation system. But when you're sitting there and watching it, you know, who else is in the gallery? I've always been curious about that. Who's there? Who's watching these moments play out? I would imagine it was fairly packed and it was a hot ticket.
For parts of the trial, yes, especially the votes. Not all the time in between was packed. There were moments, but you were like, oh, nobody's here. But the moments that were important had people, you know, I didn't know this, but there's different galleries in that whole balcony. So like in addition to the part for the set aside for the press, there's a part for families. So you would see like spouses of members of Congress there. There is a gallery for diplomats.
There is?
There is,
wow.
Which actually, just so the viewers know, Jim pointed out to me before I went to D.C., and I tried to find out which diplomats were there going to watch this particularly obscure part of American democracy in action, and the State Department doesn't actually tell you which embassies take the tickets, but they do, like, they had an allotment of 21 tickets per day for, you know, diplomats to come watch if they wanted to. And there's members of the public who could get tickets through their senators to go watch, and Some senators said that there was actually not a big demand for these tickets. Others said that they had people come up and just be really interested and wanted to watch.
Obviously one of the big moments was when Mitt Romney gave the speech on the Senate floor announcing that he was going to be voting for at least one of the articles of impeachment. I know you weren't in the gallery at the time, but you were there in the Capitol. Was there a palpable sense of, oh my goodness, what did he just say?
So there was anticipation for his speech. And we knew it was coming, and so everyone in the press.
Because it was scheduled. Everyone knew it was 2 p.m.
In the press, yes. I don't know if in the public they did. And in the Capitol, even if you're not in the gallery, all the TVs are set to one news station or another, or C-SPAN. And so all the TVs were tuned to what was going on. And nobody was really watching until, like, Mitt Romney came up, right? There were certain senators that just got more attention because they were moderates, because you didn't know exactly what they were going to say. And, his office sort of set this up where he had given interviews before that were not to be published until he spoke.
With the New York Times, with the Atlantic.
So I think they knew what was coming. And he had been, I actually tweeted a picture at one point, just surrounded by reporters anytime he walked to and from his office. One of the things about the Capitol is there's a lot of access where you can just go up to lawmakers and, put a recorder in their face and, like, ask them questions. They don't have to answer, but, like, these gaggles form going up escalators in the middle of these very tight old hallways. And the Mitt Romney gaggles were some of the bigger ones because everybody wanted to know what he was going to do.
Where do you think we are now? I mean, this is a hard question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Where do you think we are now after all this we've gone through, the impeachment, the State of the Union, the prayer breakfast, everything that's sort of followed since? I mean, the tension, we talked about this before, there's a great deal of tension now. Where are we as a country, you think?
I go back to being in the chamber for the State of the Union in the House, where even the colleagues who have gone to 20 or 30 of these noted that the split in the room was just particularly awkward, particularly difficult. Usually you see one side stand up and clap where the other side doesn't, and that's sort of like the regular partisanship. But here we were talking about the Democratic side looking sort of stunned at times or sullen, groaning out loud, saying, oh no, the Republican side celebrating because they knew the next day there was going to be an acquittal. This feeling inside the room like it was sort of a produced reality show of sorts because there were things happening with, like, giving Rush Limbaugh the Medal of Freedom. And
yeah, what was the reaction on the Democratic side when that occurred?
That's when they groaned. That's when you could audibly hear people react to it. So it felt difficult. It felt tense. It felt awkward. It was very strange being there and seeing it in real life where, like, as a reflection of the country, half of them thinks one thing and half of them thinks something else.
Well, and being that there's always a Florida connection to things, the State of the Union also featured, and I consider Venezuela to be part of Florida at this point. Juan Guaido is there, but there was also that moment when the president echoed his defense for the Second Amendment, where Fred Guttenberg, one of the parents from Parkland, obviously started shouting something and was removed. He's since apologized. I spoke to him on the phone the other day, and obviously he's trying to decompress. He felt bad about the way he handled that. He was caught up in the emotion, but had to be surreal in the moment as well.
I didn't realize until I saw him being escorted out that he was there, but it turns out he was a guest of Speaker Nancy Pelosi's. And as he has done in the past, he spoke up about, like, what about my daughter, when he heard a defense of the Second Amendment. And so, yeah, I did not expect the sort of Miami connections, seeing Juan Guaido, seeing Fred Guttenberg there. But it shows you how, so many big news stories come through this state.
Well, let's just talk about Guaido for just a minute, the last minute that we're talking about. One of the things, whether you are a fan or not a fan, he's walked a very careful line in terms of keeping Republicans and Democrats not trying to play favorites. He's met with the president. He's met with the speaker. He meets with Democrats. He meets with Republicans. He seems to have figured out how to navigate Washington pretty well, hasn't he?
It was interesting that when he was introduced at the State of the Union, and he was a last-minute guest, so not everybody in the room knew that he was going to be there, it was one of the few bipartisan standing ovations.
And it seemed genuine. I mean, there was genuine cheering.
I think we have to see if this is going to mean anything different in Venezuela or not for him. I think for the president, he probably knew that after a year of Venezuela not actually changing and having, spoken a big game last year about how regime change was coming in some fashion. This was a way to recapture momentum among the voters in South Florida who think Venezuela is an important issue in the 2020 election. So we're going to see if that holds between now and November.
It's ironic to see Republicans standing and cheering for Guaido, who is, you know, clearly not the oppressive regime of Maduro, but from a political standpoint, he's certainly far to the left, probably in terms of his policies and beliefs and politics, than many of the Republicans would normally be comfortable with dealing when they start decrying the avenues of socialism.
Which shows you that this is less about the American political spectrum, right, and how different it is in other countries. But yeah, it was striking to see just sort of the bipartisan response that it got.
All right, Patty Mazzei, thank you very much for coming in.
My pleasure.
All right.